Hello. Hi. Good morning, everyone. As was just said, my name is Zachary Kaplan. I'm Executive Director of Rhizome, which is an internet art and culture organization affiliated with the New Museum in New York City. I just want to start by thanking MIT, Phi, of course, IDFA, the Netherlands Institute for Sound and Vision for having me here today, and also in particular Sarah and Miriam and Anna for all their help in getting me here. And also, I'm just so honored to follow Rick, who's someone I've long admired, and I think our talks will echo in some ways, and then some of the provocations he raised, I'm going to get to the way that Rhizome is maybe answering some of those provocations. So let me begin by admitting that I also am not a preservation professional, and the organization that I run, though it maintains care for more than 2,000 born digital artworks, is not a traditional museum, library, or archive. And while we have a team of dedicated software developers, all creating tools for digital preservation, we're also not a software startup. That said, we've kind of become all of those things fairly accidentally by sheer need. We set out on this kind of odd path 20 years ago, but as recently as just 3 years ago, many of you in this room, maybe all of you, had probably not heard of our work with net art or performative media or preservation. And in those past 3 years, we've seen the relevance of Rhizome's preservation work, its archive work, its curatorial work, and its software development work radically grow in influence and impact. So today, I wanted to explain how Rhizome got to that point, fairly by accident, and then talk a little bit about the fields of digital preservation and the fields of software development for preservation that we wish to see in the world. In doing so, I'm going to touch on our projects, but later today, my esteemed colleague Mark Beasley, who's our senior developer for Web Recorder, will discuss some of the more technical aspects, so I'll skip over those. Rhizome was founded in 1996 by the artist Mark Tribe to champion other artists, making some of the first work to be made for a newly widely available World Wide Web. Capital I internet art, of course, has a much longer history, but Rhizome was integral in the coming together of the nascent practices we term net art that acts on computer networks and has acted on them. Rhizome's was a niche community, a niche of a niche of a niche of a niche, a listserv in its earliest days where practitioners and enthusiasts could share links and create an artistic and critical context for their nascent practices. This played out in mailboxes, links and missives circulating widely, without order or direction. Hence the name Rhizome, like the root system without beginning or end. A popular, if of course intellectual, way to characterize a potentially liberatory political structure that was non-hierarchical and without leadership. The web could bring about a rhizomatic world, our founders thought, and perhaps that outcome could be aided by a cultural institution that mimicked those approaches. Quickly finding a public, however, we established a more traditional standalone website, more legible to the average user, that would collate the email list and very soon present browser-based works. Oh, there we go. From its earliest days, net art practices were prolific, and there was an immediate sense of the web as an open-ended and rapidly evolving space for creative expression. In that Rhizome was committed to elevating and contextualizing net art practices, you could say that memory was on our mind from the outset. But it wasn't until 1999, during the height of the dot-com boom and its churn of development and bust, that a realization of the fragility of the prolific output we so believed in set in. So that year, Mark founded the Artbase, which until 2008 was a unique open accession archive of net art and sundry other born digital types. Artbase was founded because it was clear that a lack of traditional museum and gallery support for digital and net art practices in exhibitions and in collections, as well as poor memory practices with regard to digital technologies overall, were going to snuff out entire generations of art history if nothing else was done. In a classic anti-institutional Rhizome-like move, we said that we'd accept whatever from whomever as long as it came as a link or a file and called itself art. In doing so, we actually collected a great deal of weird, nasty, rare, born digital things, a true rogues gallery. And in another anti-institutional position, we said we'd hold on to that material until someone specifically asked us not to, without taking ownership, with the creator retaining full copyright, and with the promise to maintain access to that work. Access and our promise to maintain it for that rogues gallery of sundry born digital types, that was kind of the crucial accident that led us to the point that we're at today. At the time, the commitment was surely not fully understood, and how our understanding of that commitment has evolved has had a profound impact on our organization. So I skipped ahead accidentally, but oh no, that actually is correct. At first, our plan to work like a repository, accepting files and links and descriptions and making them public, worked fairly well. So Rhizome was a very small team, like 1 or 2 people. But we had the capacity to tinker with what was by then rhizome.org, curating art-based works online, and generally we had the luxury of sitting back while pieces more or less worked as created. So this was one of our earliest interfaces to the art base. It was kind of one of those tinkering projects where you would explore this collection of born digital artifacts through this kind of linkage of key terms. It's really amazing. These were, as I previously mentioned, primarily browser-based works and some software pieces created with tools like Adobe Flash, Macromedia Director, Real Audio, VRML. Today, those building blocks are considered dangerous or an eyesore, primarily because they don't work on an iPad, but many exciting, important cultural artifacts were created with them and for them. But in any event, in those early days, access was a fairly simple task. By 2007, and this is a later image of the art base, those once essential creative tools for net art were already being deprecated. The hardware itself had changed to such a degree that works that once looked so great now distorted, creaked, or just vanished. Additionally, a new generation of artists were making work not for their own custom websites, but embedded elsewhere in platforms like YouTube, where the comments and view counts and the circulation through embedding were as much the work as anything created by the artist. We were still accumulating art-based works, but it was clear that even though we had files, and tons of complete files, those were not access. Much of the art we championed was resolutely unrecognizable or unplayable on any modern machine. So in 2008, we closed our open accessioning of art and refocused on a more curatorial selection about technical characteristics or works that we had commissioned or just things that were really important for our field. And in 2009, so only 8 years ago, we were able to hire our first part-time preservation employee who worked 1 or 2 days a week and created a preservation plan. But then finally in 2014, 3 years ago, we were able to hire our first full-time preservation director, Dragan Espenshede, who still oversees our development program. Dragan came equipped with a new language to describe our problem. The existing preservation field, he argued, was concerned with files, first maintaining until it no longer ran, and this was us, then maintaining legacy hardware to run that file, hardware always breaks, or converting or recreating the file to run on new machines, which is arduous and time-consuming. File and computing environment, moreover, were often considered inseparable, defined within the same artifact's object boundary. And this just could not work for Rhizome, which was 1, poor, 2, barely staffed, and 3, faced with, again, more than 2,000 works to maintain. And those works inherently resisted the kind of definition that traditional archival practices sought to assert onto them. So Dragan brought kind of 3 preservation tenets to evade that traditional approach. I'm actually not going to talk about this work because I don't have that much time, but I just like to have art behind me. It's a great example of all of these elements. The first is performativity, the idea that born digital things should be understood as what they really are, illegible gobbledygook code made incomprehensible to users via a given machine and software environment, and that gobbledygook code can look very different depending on the network of interdependent links performing it. Internet, web, browser, computer, user, all of these things need to align for this net artwork to perform. And this is true for even just a basic Microsoft Word document, of course. Lots of things which are explicitly located outside of that file need to align for you to be able to read what's just, in my case, plain English. It's all performance, and preserving access to that performance is preserving access to that artifact. NetArt was the perfect illustration of this performative view, because the one element that made browser artwork really quite exciting and important was its very lack of canonical representation and its wide distribution. Which leads to the second tenet, the inherent variability of performance, which suggests that any peg definition for performance is a fool's game. For example, with browser-based art, there was never one computer ensemble that was canonical, but rather entire ecosystems of hardware and software used fairly interchangeably at the individual user's level. And so with that in mind, the browser-based artwork, what needs to be preserved is not a stabilized object, but rather, in that case, like a browser paired with an OS, paired with hardware, but the ability to stay variable. And from there, crucially, came this belief that the file and the computing environment could best be understood if they were separated and then recombined for that variable performance. And finally, with that variability, we thought a lot about decentralization. There's such a vastness in born digital creation and expression of all kinds, and such a range in every artifact's performance and needs that traditional centralized archival practices for entire types of objects just don't seem to make sense anymore. And that was something that Rick obviously just touched on. That and the questions that underrepresented views and archives ask, I'll touch on in my concluding remarks. So with these three tenets, performativity, variability, and decentralization, Rhizome became committed to archiving and maintaining access to the performance of these networked objects while modeling the way a focused institution could bring its own concerns and needs to a field which has often had these monolithic approaches. There was very little software to service this point of view, and again, almost accidentally, the needs of the net art we sought to champion led us in a new direction, which was building our own. So here, Dragan brought with him to Rhizome an existing relationship with the University of Freiburg in Germany, and namely their expert computer scientist, Klaus Reschert. Together, they had previously worked on Emulation as a Service, a cloud-based framework to easily present emulated legacy computing environments within a browser window. Emulation, as all of you know, has a long history in preservation, but the needs of net art in a public institution, especially an online public institution like our own, was to bring emulation to the kind of broad audience our nonprofit serves. And this is kind of accessing folks who are beyond the kind of enthusiast communities who maybe are well aware of how to install an emulator on their computer, although we do get a lot of advice and cues from that community. Emulation as a Service was perfect for this in that you no longer had to fumble with the parts. Rhizome was able to deliver a fully interactive, emulated environment, pre-prepared with specific artifacts directly to a browser window. So we premiered this with this work by Corey Archangel from 2014 called Bomb Iraq, which was this kind of perfect piece. It's a ready-made, a pre-internet Macintosh TV found in a Buffalo Salvation Army, and stocked with a homebrew hypercard game made by the computer's previous teenage owner. In it, all you do is drop a bomb on the country of Iraq. It was made just after the conflict. It's bizarre and gross and a very kind of weird artifact of this pre-internet computing environment. Corey had presented it in 2005 at Pace Wildenstein, and the computer died on the first day, which is like the classic end for hardware-based presentation. Through Emulation as a Service, we were able to bring the entire computing environment back to life and distribute it to a broad audience where one could relive the experience of finding someone else's old computer. We also used this to represent the Teresa Duncan CD-ROMs in 2015, 3 games for young girls, wildly influential and yet widely unavailable due to their reliance on legacy tech. And recently we used this to present an early version, a hack of an early version of Photoshop called Heritage Gold, which replaces traditional Photoshop editing tools with tools to edit race and class and social position. And so this work, which relies on this early version of Photoshop and a legacy computing environment, had not been experienced for nearly 20 years. In short, Emulation as a Service is perfect to easily present interactive legacy artifacts in full software context to a very wide audience. And in deploying them on public cloud computing resources, it's also quite easy to scale. So when we launched the Teresa Duncan CD-ROMs, we just presented an in-browser emulator at theverge.com, which has a huge audience, and it worked perfectly. Emulation is core to our preservation strategy, and we've iterated from there. So Old Web Today, created by our lead developer, Ilya Kramer, is an emulation framework for a much more streamlined use case. As I said, the art base houses many browser-based works, and even with our team that's quite big, quite a lot larger than we were in 1999, there's no way we could service each individually. So Old Web allows the quick performance of all sorts of web archives, like the Rhizome art base, within emulated legacy browsers, all running on public cloud computing infrastructure. The project encapsulates our point of view that artifact and environment are two separate things to be arranged in an arbitrary combination. An artwork can be viewed in one browser or another without changing the work itself, while still impacting its performance aspects. So this is just an example. One of the first earliest made artist websites, www.jody.org from 1995. And the work is on unchanged, unaltered platforms, is radically different than when it was premiered in 1995. In particular, it relies on the blink tag, which was deprecated in 2013, a really sad moment for the web. But here you can see a screen grab of it in a regular contemporary Chrome. It's not blinking, I swear, and then running in Netscape 3. So as you can see, a well-appointed browser set in Old Web Today can perform a whole suite of artworks. And we only need to set up a few types of environments to perform huge swaths of the type of work that we want to support. We've also connected Old Web to enormous archives like those of the Library of Congress and the Internet Archive, taking pages that are otherwise delivered as static or flat, and at least rendering them without any bespoke work in a more faithful browser environment, but sometimes with interactivity restored without any additional work. The other major challenge that arrived in 2008, as I mentioned, was artists creating art created within social networks and new multifaceted platforms like YouTube and Facebook. And here, any semblance of object boundaries shattered anew. Comments, view counts, shares, interactions, change of related content served up by algorithms, and then all viewed on platforms increasingly personalized by other algorithms. These became unwieldy, entirely undefinable boundaries to artworks, challenging any sense of archival objectivity. So this is this classic work by Petrichor, right, that is all about its view count, and its view count is as much, determines the value of this video. This situation demanded an entirely new solution for our web archiving purposes, and in Ilya, we were thrilled to find Web Recorder, which was a great solution that we brought in-house 2 years ago. My colleague Mark, again, will speak about this later, but in short, Web Recorder allows an individual with very little onboarding to easily archive almost any web page by interacting with it, including embedded content and complex JavaScript. So instead of treating the web as static pages to download, it treats the web as a performance, archiving interactivity, and then immediately reconstructing that interactivity with its full fidelity in an offline form. The individualized design, worm's eye collection rather than deployment of automation, proposes that if the web is increasingly personalized, web archiving will necessarily require symmetrical collection, where interaction leads what is collected, capturing an individualized viewpoint. This feels logical to us and just straightforward in the tool, and the real magic is in the dynamic reconstruction, which Ilya and Mark and our designer Pat Shu have really figured out. We've used this to collect works like this performance for Instagram by Amalia Ullman. Again, for time, I'm going to skip through the specifics, and Mark will talk a little bit more about how Web Recorder works later today. But in short, in its way that Web Recorder allows the easy capture, representation, and then eventually downloading of like a standardized work file and replay offline, it truly kind of articulates those 3 tenets that we set out to champion in digital preservation 3 years ago: performativity, variability, and decentralization. It's web archiving for all, but also for our institutional use, and those things have aligned really nicely because of our niche use case. And that said, Web Recorder also archives non-dynamic content, or what we refer to as non-dynamic content, very easily as well. So these are 2 works that are now being captured in Web Recorder using remote browsers. So these are old web browsers that have been equipped with, for instance, Flash to reperform this work from 2005 that was built with Flash. This was built with LiveScript, the precursor to JavaScript, and is being represented in an old web browser, having been captured via Web Recorder. These 3 tools that I've just described, Emulation as a Service, Old Web Today, and Web Recorder, reflect our approach to digital preservation and have led us to the position that we occupy today. Emulation as a Service is an enterprise-level preservation solution. So with our partner, University of Freiburg, we team up with cultural organizations to test use cases. But Old Web and Web Recorder are made available entirely for free online along with their code. And I mentioned decentralization, and it is a major priority for Rhizome. By this, I mean not only the decentralization of web archives across institutions of all kinds, big like a Stanford and small, very small like us, but also web archiving by all sorts of users, individuals, groups, collectives. And this, again, I'm touching on some of the things that Rick mentioned. And those individual users, those groups, those collectives, can represent a real diversity of perspectives and life experiences. So at this point, I can kind of admit that Rhizome is a digital preservation organization to a great degree, even if accidentally. And we became one due to this kind of accident of our institutional need and what we've come to call the crisis of digital social memory and its impact on our field in particular. So much culture and life plays out online today, and that's net art for us, but also things way, way beyond. And yet there are still so few homes for the memory of those important activities, and so few stewards to guide the proper way to capture that memory. Stewards with different views and backgrounds are a necessity going ahead. So we at Rhizome firmly believe that our idiosyncratic path to our position in preservation has benefited the field and raised questions that otherwise might not have been asked. We have 3 great tools to show for it, as well as real access to essential works of net art. That said, there are countless other organizations that could be creating collections and that could be asking important questions of preservation practices. And we believe to that end that by offering tools free of charge, by open sourcing them, by being promiscuous with our partnerships, so seriously, if you have an interesting use case, reach out to me. My email's at the end of this presentation. That in all those efforts, we can help decentralize the field of digital preservation, from web archiving to software preservation, making sure that dire questions are asked and that digital social memory is more thoughtfully and responsibly secure. I'm sounding utopian, and it's really not easy. There are difficult questions to ask, and we at Rhizome certainly don't have the answers, and I'm sure no one in this room has all the answers, and our field will need to broaden to reach anything near those answers. And some examples I would give are the fact that, like, our emulation work rests entirely in a gray market exchange, tacitly accepted by major tech players. So what is the right to legacy software that has so ordered our world in the commons? This is a huge question that loops together archiving professionals, policy experts, corporate bodies, and vast general publics. Our work with Web Recorder, which directly puts archiving tools in the hands of anyone who wants them, and asks them to be archived, and asks them to archive their personalized web, also asks very difficult ethical questions. And again, this is touching on some of the things that Rick raised. A perfect example of this comes from our partnership with the amazing Documenting the Now project, part of our Mellon Foundation cohort under the great Burgess Jules at University of California, Riverside, and Ed Summers at University of Maryland. Among other projects, they set out to archive #Ferguson on Twitter and other social media sites, following the community uprising there. But at this time, when the law, especially in the United States, is weaponizing memory to subdue dissent, in this context, the wholesale archiving of photos, actions, usernames on something like Twitter is not a tenable activity. DocNow is asking how anonymity, screening, and community management can inform an archive and its collection practices to protect both memory and individuals. A small organization, DocNow is asking that question because it's one broader fields of archiving have failed to address. With tools like Web Recorder, together with other automated and individualized projects, you can now capture or scrape most everything on the web. But of course, the question is, should we? Of course, the questions of privacy, the boundaries to collection. And to answer those questions, we're going to need to broaden the conversation to include a diversity of voices, perspectives, identities, and experiences. And to get at that point, earlier this year, we hosted our first Ethics and Digital Preservation Conference at the New Museum, supported by Knight Foundation, created in close collaboration with DocNow. We'll be picking it up again at the New Museum in winter 2018, so I hope some of you can join. But a particularly trenchant panel at that first event brought together Burgess, scholar Simone Brown, writer Doreen St. Felix, and archivist Camila Janine Rashad to discuss the failure of archives to properly care for Blackness as a subject. Both the damage done by ignoring artifacts related to Black life, but also in archiving Blackness in ways that cause harm, ostracization, and erasure. And I'd really invite you to all to watch that video at rhizome.org, because it's a remarkable conversation that considers the need for tools to be in the hands of underrepresented groups, the need for the field of archives to rapidly diversify, and existentially to consider whether certain subjects can be properly cared for by archives such as they are today at all. And she gave an example, for instance, of the Vine creator who then has their meme expropriated, brought into an international market, never sees a dime from it, and ends up in like a Rhizome-like collection of vines. Like, is that okay? Colonization, appropriation, and other conditions might make it impossible for certain topics to be archived with care, period. And again, we're not the organization to answer these questions, but we do think that in our support for the creation, distribution, and demonstration of free tools and community-based strategies for digital preservation, we can support the conditions for accidents like our own to occur, accidents that generate additional new voices, that pose new questions, and offer meaningful answers. And so I hope to come to another conference like this in 10 years in a much bigger room with many more entities, many more independent archivists, creating many more tools that represent many more needs, overseeing many more archives, and more properly caring for many more experiences, ensuring real continuing access to that gobbledygook code, which is so much of our culture. And I think that conference will represent a preservation field true to the vision of the Rhizome that inspired our founders and many other internet users so many years ago. So I'd just like to thank you for welcoming me today.